Thank you for having me. I always feel like an interloper coming into the women's Bible study, so I'm always glad to be here. All my best ideas come from Dana. So the whole wilderness thing was her idea, and I'm grateful to be included in it. So Dana did a great job last week setting us up, getting us sort of into the themes of the wilderness, highlighting some different stories about people who go into the wilderness, taking you into Psalm 84, which talks about sort of making your home in the wilderness in a sense and getting through it. Today, I'm actually not going to get us into the wilderness. We're going to be on the edge of the wilderness. So a very brief, if you've kind of forgotten the context for how they get into the wilderness, very briefly, you remember God's promise to Abraham. So this is back in the early chapters of Genesis. God says to Abraham, Abraham, through your family, I will bless the world. Through your family, I'll bless the world. Now in the Bible, that's shorthand for through your family, Abraham, I will save the world. That's really what he's saying to Abraham. And when you go to the genealogies of Jesus, of course, it starts with Abraham and works its way down to Jesus. So in Jesus, he's the fulfillment of that promise to Abraham. But what were the other two things that God promised Abraham? Land and descendants as numerous as the stars, right? So he got the land. For decades, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they live in the land. But then you remember Jacob has 12 sons, and the other sons sell Joseph into slavery, and he goes down to Egypt, and then all 12 tribes come down there. And do you remember how many centuries they spend down there? About 400 years down in the land. So where did my, Dana took my pointer away. Yeah, sorry. So, there we go. So, they come down from Canaan, and they go all the way to this area here, and they kind of settle in an area right here called Goshen. Modern day Cairo is like, it's around here. But Goshen right here, and we'll come back to that. So they settle in Goshen for about 400 years, and they're eventually enslaved. And eventually God raises up Moses to go, as Dana explained last week, to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And he does, and Pharaoh's like, I don't know. And so God sends 10 plagues, and after the 10th plague, finally Pharaoh says, go. Now tonight, we're going to look at what happens when the Hebrews begin their journey home from Goshen back to the Promised Land in Canaan. And I'm going to have 3 R's tonight. The route, the remains, and the rescue. The route, the remains, and the rescue. So first, let me read you, I just had it up there, just to remind you of the story. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back into its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with the wall of water on their right and on their left. That day, the Lord saved Israel from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, their servant. Okay, so first of all, the route. These 3 R's: the route, the remains, the rescue. The route home. Now look at the map. You tell me, you learned this in geometry. What's the shortest distance between 2 points? Straight line. And where does a straight line take you? Right here. Right along the Mediterranean coast, right up here. By the way, this is sort of modern-day Gaza, right here. Right along here, along the coast, back to the Promised Land. From Goshen to the edge of the Promised Land, about 200 miles, you could do it in 7 to 14 days. So theoretically, they could have been home in 1 to 2 weeks. But God does not permit them to go that way. Instead of going northeast this way, we're told that they go southeast. Now, if you go in your Bibles, by the way, there'll be maps that show you 2 possible routes. Some people think they went down this way and crossed the sea here. I favor this one right here, right around here, because there's all the right sort of terrain for it. There's a little mountain here, a little valley where they can get trapped. But either way, God does not permit them to go the fastest way home. And they must have wondered why. I mean, anyone who knew this geography, which would have been everyone, would have wondered, why on earth are we going this way instead of this way? The path makes no sense because you're dead ending into this body of water. Now, this is very practical. I mean, sometimes, from our perspective, the logical or reasonable path is not God's path. But God knows something about the northeast path, that path that the Israelites don't know. 2 things. First of all, the Egyptians, at this point in history, I got to get a laser pointer, The Egyptians were constantly at war with the people who lived over here. So there's a lot of warfare going on along here, but there was also, right along here, there was an Egyptian garrison where the Egyptian army was stationed. And it was a very dangerous way to go. And so God does not want his people to be discouraged right at the beginning of their journey and have to turn back to Egypt. So for reasons of mercy and of wisdom and of safety that they're not going to comprehend, he does not take them on the short and logical route. Instead, he takes them on a much longer path through the water and through the desert wilderness. Now, most of you, and I'll bet you talked about some of these stories last week, you've got stories about how God took you on a different path, right? A different path than the one you expected. I've got lots of those stories in abundance, where God takes you on a wilderness journey rather than the direct route. It happens all the time with God's people. And usually, maybe always, it's only in retrospect that we can see God's wisdom and his mercy, why he took us on a different path than the one we thought that we should go on. And sometimes, the wilderness, it feels like a punishment, doesn't it? But usually the wilderness is a gift, that God takes you on this detour route out of mercy. So that's, first of all, the route. Second, the remains. Now, as the Israelites leave Egypt, we are told in Exodus 14 that Moses, he gathers up the remains of Joseph, the mummified remains. So how long have Joseph's remains been there? About 400 years. So he gathers up these remains. Now, why does Moses take Joseph's bones? Well, if you go back to Genesis 50, Joseph is dying, and he gathers his family around him, and he says, look, God promised us land back in Canaan, and he's a promise keeper. and someday he's going to take our people home, and when that happens, you gather up my bones and you take them there. So what did Joseph know 400 years before the Exodus happened? He knew that God is a keeper of promises. He makes a lot of promises, and it may take hundreds of years for these promises to get fulfilled, but God always keeps his promises. Now, God makes a lot of promises to his people. I don't know if whenever you're in a hotel, do you ever pull out the Gideon Bible that's in the nightstand next to you? You should, because the Gideons have done a really nice job of, in the front pages, they list all of God's promises in the Bible. And sometimes when I'm in a hotel by myself, I'll just pull out the Gideon Bible and I'll start reading through all the promises of God in the front of that Gideon Bible, and it's so encouraging. It's so reassuring. So God makes promises, and he keeps those promises, but he keeps his promises in his time, which is always the best time. And when things aren't working out on our timetable, we can go on because we know that God has given us his word. Now, you all probably have heard the stories of Corrie ten Boom. There's a famous one about when she meets her prison guard who sent her sister to her death. I want to tell you a different story tonight, which you may not have heard. Corrie ten Boom, if you don't know her name, she was a Dutch woman, and she and her family protected Jews during the Holocaust. They were eventually caught, and they were sent to concentration camps. And Corrie's got this very powerful story from her childhood, where she remembers sitting with her father at their oval dining room table, and she was very downcast because her father had told her that the family business was kind of tanking. And they had this big bill that had come due, and Corrie said, "Father, what are we going to do?" And her father said, "Don't worry, Corrie, we won't fall. Underneath us are the everlasting arms of God." And Corrie said, "Father, is that in the Bible?" And he said, "Yes, Deuteronomy 33:27. The eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath you are his everlasting arms." Well, 30 years later, Corrie was lying next to her sister Betsy in cramped quarters in a concentration camp, and she could hear and feel, Betsy's feeble and irregular heartbeat, and she wondered if there was anything she could say and to bring a word of encouragement to her sister. And all of a sudden, she remembered that conversation with her father. And she said to Betsy, she said, "Remember what Father said. God is your dwelling place, and underneath you are his everlasting arms." And Betsy died soon after, but Corrie remembered how much that reassured her. She died resting on that promise that the Lord would catch her. And so sometimes when you're in the wilderness, it's just the promises of God and his character that we have to lean on. In the wilderness, sometimes it's the promises of God that keep us going. And you'll have a chance tonight in your small groups to look at some of the promises of God. I pulled a few out of the Gideon Bible for you. So Joseph, did he see the promises of God in his lifetime about the return from Egypt? And the answer is no, but he depended on them. He said, God made a promise, and he's going to fulfill it one day, and when he does, you gather up my bones and you take them home. Now, that's the route, the remains, finally the rescue. So God not only reroutes the Israelites, instead of the northeast journey, he takes them on the southeast journey, and they dead end into a body of water, the Red Sea. And they look back, and what do they see behind them? They see Pharaoh's army and his iron chariots. Now, I've said this before, but we don't think much about chariots, but iron chariots in this period were the super weapon. They were the F-35 or whatever the latest, greatest assault, plane that we have now is. They were the killer thing to have, and Pharaoh's got lots of them. So they are caught between death on this side, drowning, and death on the other side from Pharaoh and his army, certain slaughter. Now that's a problem, but the children of Israel actually have bigger problems. They have spiritual problems. I think Dana may have alluded to this last week, but they're absolutely deluded at this point. They're delusional about the past. Verse 12, They turn to Moses and they say, "You jerk, we were fine back in Egypt. We didn't want to leave Egypt. You've dragged us out of Egypt. Everything was great back there." Now, is that true? You know it's not true. They were slaves, they were unhappy, they were delusional. They never said anything like that to Moses. Back when they were in Egypt, they believed in Moses and they believed in God. That's what actually happened. But now they've altered their memory. They're delusional about the past. They're also delusional about the present. They say, it would be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die. We'd rather go back to slavery than die. Really? I mean, what's missing from that line of thinking? A normal group of people, a reasonable group of people would say, we just saw God send 10 plagues on Pharaoh that were so dominating that Pharaoh was forced to release us, and he brought the most powerful, influential, wealthy nation in the world to its knees, and we just walked through water on our right and on our left. They haven't done that yet. But he saved us, and here we are, and he's saved us in the past. He can save us again. But is God in the equation for them? He is not. He's not in the equation at all. It doesn't occur to them. There's no hope. And you got to ask, how can they be so hopeless after what they've just seen God do? And the answer to why they're so hopeless is because they're still slaves. Now, how do modern people define freedom? In our modern culture, freedom is being able to do what?
Whatever I want.
Whatever you want to do, right? That's the answer. That's how we think of freedom. It's having no Lord, no master, no restrictions on yourself at all. But Exodus shows us that this kind of freedom is actually impossible. By modern definition, the Hebrews, when they're right here, they're free. Because they're not under Pharaoh's yoke anymore, right? But they haven't yet gotten to Mount Sinai down here where they're going to get the Ten Commandments. So they're not under God's yoke, and they're not under Pharaoh's yoke. They're completely free. How do you like them? Do you want to be like them? No. They're miserable people because they're still slaves. They're slaves to fear. They're slaves to circumstances. And you look at Moses in contrast. Moses is absolutely cool. He says, stand firm. Don't be afraid. He's not enslaved to fear. He's not enslaved to the circumstances. He has met God face to face. He's already under the yoke of God. So here's the point. Either you are a servant of God or you're a servant of something else. Either you serve God or you are in bondage to something else. No one is free in the modern sense. You never really belong to yourself. This is a major theme in Exodus, but we get to it, the heart of it, in this passage here. The Bible teaches that you will live for something. Rocky Balboa put it best. His girlfriend, you remember Adrian? She says, Rocky, why are you putting yourself through all this? This is in the first movie. And Rocky says, I just want to go the distance. Then I'll know that I'm not a bum. Now, you may not put it that way in your own life, but every human being, every one of us, has to do something about encroaching bumness, right? The fear that maybe your life is meaningless, maybe you really don't have any purpose, maybe you're just a bum. And so everyone looks for something to live for. And the Bible says if you build your life around anything other than God, it will eventually come after you and it will destroy you. So they're delusional. They really are. But that doesn't stop God from keeping his promises. Moses extends his staff, the sea parts, and they go through on dry land. So let me draw this to a close, 2 practical things, and you'll go into your groups. First of all, I don't know if you caught at the very beginning of our passage today. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Some of you need to move on out of whatever is enslaving you. And that may mean going deeper into the wilderness. That's what they have to do. Moving on means going through the sea. It means going into the wilderness. Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. They needed to move on from Egypt into the wilderness. And if the Lord has saved you from a mess, He didn't save you from that so you can stay there. He saved you from it so you can move on out of it. He wants you to keep moving forward. We're not to go back to the things that have enslaved us. Now that may mean, I don't know what it means for anyone here, but it could mean, and I've seen it mean for people, that some people need to change their friendships. For some people, moving on means radical changes in how you use your free time or some of your thought habits. It can mean a job change. I mean, there's all kinds of things this could mean, even if it takes you into the wilderness. So don't go back to Egypt. God never meant for you to stay there. Second and finally, what is it that causes the waters to part? Was it the faith of the people? No. It was not their faith that caused the water to part. There were two kinds of people who walked through the parted waters that day. There were people with very strong faith, and there were people with very weak faith. Now, I wish I could have seen it, because the people with the strong faith probably walked through and were like, this is pretty cool. I think in the recent movie that came out 10 years ago, they actually kind of pictured this. There were people like looking at, you see sharks swimming around in the water on the other side, Like, it was probably pretty cool for those who had strong faith. And then there were probably people with weak faith who were doing what? Running like crazy, sprinting to the other side out of fear. So you had people with strong faith, you had people with weak faith going through the water, but they all crossed from death into life. So, if you're ever sitting on the fence with Jesus, or people who are sitting on the fence with Jesus in terms of going all in, because you think that you need a huge amount of faith in order to get where Jesus is taking you, remember, he said all you need is a smidgen, a mustard seed of faith. So, they're going to go from here, They're going to go from here down to here across the Red Sea and then into the Sinai and Midian wilderness. Now, that's how they get into the wilderness. I did not assign you any homework this week, but I want to suggest that you try something. In the book of Numbers, you can find the stories of the things that happened in the wilderness. For example, the manna coming down, the giving of the Ten Commandments and the law, the story of Moses striking the rock with his staff and water coming out, both occasions that happened. You see the story of the snakes biting them, and Moses has to put a bronze serpent and put it on the staff. There's all kinds of great stories about what happens in the wilderness, and what I want to suggest is that you read them for pleasure. You don't have to sit and meditate on them for a long time. I don't do enough of that. I might do too much Bible study. You can read the Bible for pleasure. So what I want to encourage you to do in the coming week is just read those stories to get them back into your system. Read them for pleasure. And the Lord will speak to you through that. It won't take long to read them. And then next week, so tonight we looked at them on the edge of the Promised Land. Next week we're going to look at what happens 2 years in when they get to the edge of Canaan. The edge of, I think I just misspoke. We were on the edge of the wilderness. We're going to look at next week at what happens 2 years after this. They're on the edge of the Promised Land. They're just about to go in, and they don't make it. And we're going to look at what keeps them in the wilderness for another 40 years. Okay? Let me pray for you, and then I guess you head off. Father, thank you for your scriptures. I pray, Lord, that you would help us all to move on deeper into whatever journey you have for each of us, that fear, Lord, would not keep us in one place, that we would not be enslaved to anything, Lord, that would keep us from moving forward, and that we would only be, Lord, held by you, held by your everlasting arms. And I pray this in the name of Jesus, and that you bless the conversations that happen now. Amen.